At exactly 3:17 each night, in a data center on the outskirts of Frankfurt, a scheduled handshake occurs between two autonomous systems. The process is silent, instantaneous, and, under ordinary conditions, invisible to the billions of people it affects. If that handshake fails, routing tables across dozens of countries would begin recalculating. Some platforms would slow, others would disappear. In certain cities, entire providers would quietly reroute through backup corridors, unaware that the disruption was not technical, but contractual. Most users, waking up to refresh news feeds and stream music, would never notice. They would thank their providers, perhaps their Wi-Fi. They would not wonder who scheduled the handshake, or who owns the rights to the peering agreement that made it possible, because internet access feels immediate, personal, local. We unlock phones, connect laptops, toggle airplane mode. The infrastructure is assumed, a service delivered through towers, cables, satellites, and contracts. But behind that surface lies a terrain most people never think about: interconnection. The web doesn't run on signals, it runs on agreements, and not just between countries or providers, but between invisible entities that define how, when, and through whom traffic is permitted to move. You don't pay for access to the internet. You pay for access to someone who has access, and they, in turn, rely on a hierarchy of transit layers, peering nodes, and routing permissions, the rules of which are largely opaque, rarely updated, and quietly controlled, not by regulators, not by states, but by private entities that do not appear in public indexes of power. In this space, the interstitial layer, where networks negotiate with other networks, one name has never appeared on the door, but its presence is etched into protocol. The handshake in Frankfurt? Its structure was first defined in a 1996 arbitration clause between two regional IXPs. That clause was drafted by a consulting firm no longer in operation, but its intellectual property, and the conditions under which it must still be applied, are held in perpetuity by a trust established by the Ramir family. You've never heard of them, and if everything continues to function, you never will. When we think about who controls the internet, the usual images rise quickly. Tech CEOs in black turtlenecks, regulators in committee hearings, billionaires buying social media platforms, governments imposing digital firewalls. These are the figures who populate headlines, documentaries, and congressional testimonies. Their power is visible, even theatrical, a spectacle of influence. They build apps, sign laws, flip switches on stage. They make decisions that feel enormous. But they do not determine whether your city connects to the backbone tomorrow. They do not dictate which routes your packets take. They do not decide if your regional provider remains in a Tier 2 loop or escalates into a Tier 1 peering ecosystem. That level of power is quiet. It exists where systems talk to systems, not where people make announcements. The illusion of centralized authority masks a reality far more fractured, procedural, and inertial. Infrastructure, unlike platforms, does not trend. It stabilizes. At the heart of global connectivity is not data, but permission. Every network is a negotiation, and those negotiations are rarely governed by policy or ideology. They are governed by clauses. Who peers with whom? Who pays settlement? Who gets priority routing under congestion? Who must defer during asymmetric load? These rules are not democratic. They are inherited, embedded, and astonishingly resistant to revision. Most users believe they're on the internet, but in truth, they are on a narrow slice of it, one shaped entirely by which interconnection agreements their service provider maintains. A single modification to a peering clause, often buried in decades-old documents, can reroute traffic thousands of kilometers. Not because of failure, but because the system recalculated what was allowed. The Ramir family never built networks. They never installed cables. They never sold consumer access. But they placed themselves at the joints, where networks meet, where permissions are exchanged, where priority is settled. And over time, those positions became structural, not visible, not acknowledged, but necessary. Because in the world of routing, there is no center, only sequence. And those who define the sequence define the experience. The Ramir family did not start with telecommunications. Their story begins, as many quiet dynasties do, in compliance. In the late 1970s, Laurent Ramier, a corporate auditor with a background in technical accounting, specialized in an obscure niche, validating the billing integrity of interoperator settlements between European telephone carriers. It was not a glamorous field. His job was to pore over call termination records, trace discrepancies in analog signal logging, and ensure that one provider wasn't overcharging another during peak hour handoffs. It was tedious, pattern-driven work, but it placed him near a critical junction. the interface between infrastructure and trust. By the time digital switching began to replace analog exchanges in the early 1980s, Laurent had already positioned himself not as an operator, but as a neutral validator. He launched a firm that didn't manage calls, but wrote verification procedures, the standards by which calls could be certified as valid, billable, or disputed. His firm didn't touch the traffic itself. It defined the accounting logic that determined how much that traffic was worth. Then came packet switching, and with it, a void. As early backbone networks began linking universities and research labs across borders, the protocols for traffic exchange were still experimental. IP addresses were static, routing was fragile, and few understood how to value traffic that didn't follow a one-to-one billing model. Ramir's firm began drafting cost-neutral settlement frameworks, not for national networks, but for the growing web of private and academic systems that needed to exchange data fairly. Their early reports were passed between operators informally, often anonymously, but they were used because they worked. By 1993, when commercial ISPs began replacing research networks, Ramir's documentation had already been baked into dozens of interconnection templates across Europe. His company, now quietly folded into a holding registered in Liechtenstein, had ceased issuing reports. Instead, it licensed templates, not to carriers, but to the consortia that govern Internet Exchange Points, IXPs. These IXPs didn't own infrastructure either. They coordinated it, and they needed frameworks that operators would agree on without renegotiating every 6 months. The Ramirs never chased ownership. That was the rule. No assets, no infrastructure, no influence over endpoints, only formatting. They defined how a peering request must be structured, how a dispute must be escalated, how capacity must be reported during failure scenarios. Their greatest achievement was procedural, to become the assumed neutral template in a space allergic to regulation. The family's second generation didn't appear in business journals or speak at conferences. They trained as economists, not engineers. Their work appeared in footnotes, white-labeled, co-authored, embedded inside collaborative initiatives funded by public-private telecom alliances. They understood the tempo of infrastructure, slow, layered, consensus-driven, but extremely hard to dislodge once a standard takes hold. By the early 2000s, at least 17 IXPs in Europe and Asia were using modified Ramir origin protocols for route arbitration and peering policy escalation. Not because they were compelled to, because no one else had done the work. The family's internal principle never changed. Do not operate networks, operate between them. They avoided trademark registrations. They avoided foundation boards. They refused investment in infrastructure providers. Their trust was built on silence and survived by staying small enough not to be noticed, but large enough to be essential. When a new interconnection agreement needed a fallback clause for transit settlement in high latency conditions, the default language came from a Ramir-authored template first drafted in 1998. When regional regulators requested dispute mediation language for carrier disputes, they were quietly directed to the same clause, now abstracted into a policy kit issued by a standards group in Geneva. That standards group's operating budget was partially underwritten by a Luxembourg-based charitable foundation with no listed directors, but a filing trail that loops, eventually, back to a dormant Ramir asset management office in Zurich. They weren't hiding. They were formatting. Influenced not by persuasion, but by predefinition. And through it all, they upheld one structural rule above all: never be the source of connectivity. Only be the condition under which connectivity happens. By the mid-2000s, the Ramir presence no longer resembled a family at all. It had transmuted, not into a company, not into a brand, but into something far harder to locate: a sequence of procedural expectations embedded across global interconnection layers. Their legacy was no longer attached to names or documents. It had become a rhythm, a structural inheritance that operators followed, not because they knew where it came from, but because deviating from it would require rebuilding the logic of agreement from scratch. Their influence expanded not through acquisition, but through repetition. Each time a regional internet exchange drafted a new participant agreement, it consulted the same familiar procedural toolkit. Each time an ISP in South America or Southeast Asia sought neutrality clauses for peering with transnational carriers, the fallback language mirrored phrasing first seen in Ramir-authored compliance scaffolds a decade earlier. Not copied, inherited, translated, folded into best practices until best practices stopped being attributed at all. One of the most enduring features of this system was its deliberate mundanity. Nothing in the Ramir framework was designed to attract attention. Every component, capacity reporting tables, dispute resolution timelines, service disruption tolerances, was constructed to look like the default. And because these defaults reduce friction, they were adopted again and again by operators with more urgent problems to solve. Some pieces spread vertically. A Geneva-based software validator, spun off from a now-defunct intercarrier working group, embedded Ramier-style escalation rules into a widely used peering management dashboard. That dashboard became the standard for over 60 mid-size IXPs worldwide. Others spread laterally. A foundation in the Netherlands produced training modules for carrier-neutral policy design. The modules reused diagrams and terminology aligned with Ramier's older billing logic, unaware, in some cases, of the source. The diagrams worked. That was enough. Crucially, no Ramier-controlled entity appeared on public governance boards. Their presence was not regulatory. It was gravitational. Engineers working on internet routing protocols would frequently cite standard peering arbitration clauses in white papers, without specifying where those standards originated. Legal teams in telecom mergers would insert jurisdiction-neutral conflict resolution clauses that matched Ramier templates word for word, not because of pressure, but because deviation introduced risk, not legal risk, procedural uncertainty. By 2011, a technical audit of routing agreements in the Asia-Pacific region found that over 40% of cross-provider failover clauses shared a common three-tier escalation model. That model had no author listed, but it traced, through 5 degrees of abstraction, to a packet loss compensation matrix developed by the Ramier Group during an unpublished arbitration in Brussels in 1997. And yet, no one used Ramier protocols. No one licensed Ramier software. They simply followed the structure that had, over time, become too embedded to rethink. Even when disputes occurred, the system protected itself. In 2014, a major North American carrier attempted to renegotiate a legacy peering agreement that included bandwidth asymmetry thresholds. The clause was outdated, poorly suited to video streaming loads, but adjusting it triggered conflicts across 3 other networks whose agreements relied on the original format. Rewriting it would require coordinated renegotiation across multiple jurisdictions, insurance providers, and exchange-level capacity planning. The cost and the risk were too high. The clause stayed. The Ramier did not block the change. They weren't present. Their system was. And that system, a tangle of frameworks, exceptions, and calibration logic, was now too procedurally dense to unwind. Influence wasn't enforced. It was maintained by exhaustion. Nobody controlled the routes, but the routes still followed the same shape. In 2016, a rupture occurred, not in cables, but in assumptions. A sequence of major undersea fiber cuts, combined with aggressive route optimization failures across 2 continents, led to cascading packet loss that reached dozens of Tier 1 and Tier 2 providers. For a period of nearly 18 hours, routing tables across the Northern Hemisphere reshuffled continuously, attempting to stabilize. Major platforms slowed. Some disappeared entirely from regions they had never intended to exit. The internet didn't collapse, but it stopped behaving as expected. Governments demanded answers. Regulators issued temporary advisories. Providers scrambled for fault attribution. Yet beneath the surface, away from press briefings and incident reports, a more subtle dynamic unfolded. Amid the chaos, the entities that adapted most effectively were not the largest, nor the most technologically advanced. They were the ones whose contracts already included routing elasticity clauses, the ones whose arbitration terms contained override pathways, the ones whose fallbacks had been modeled, years earlier, on procedural templates aligned with Ramier origin logic. There was no central coordination. There didn't need to be. The documents existed. The clauses were there. Some hadn't been read in a decade, yet when the failure hit, they activated automatically. Escalation thresholds triggered predictable transitions. Packet shaping routines defaulted to a known tolerance window. Backup peers were invoked through predefined sequence calls, documented long before anyone involved had joined the company. The system flexed, and where it did, traffic resumed. What followed wasn't consolidation. It was gravitation. Suddenly, IXPs and regional providers began auditing their peering frameworks, asking not whether they were compliant, but whether they were resilient. Consultants were hired to reevaluate interconnection clauses. Almost universally, they arrived at the same conclusion. The most stable agreements weren't necessarily the most recent. They were the most predictable. And predictability, in this sector, traced back to Ramier-style formatting. In South America, a coalition of mid-sized networks adopted a standard peering resolution kit compiled by an NGO headquartered in Toronto. That NGO had never heard of the Ramiers, but their kit referenced escalation logic developed by a task force in 2004, which had been based on arbitration summaries originally produced and quietly licensed by a Ramier-affiliated consultancy during the early EU intercarrier convergence period. Elsewhere, in Asia, regulators began drafting new rules for peering transparency. Their model frameworks borrowed heavily from legacy-compatible routing templates built upon backbone failover behaviors studied in post-crisis audits. Those behaviors, in turn, had been shaped by BGP prioritization sequences, whose default assumptions match Remy-encoded weighting schemes, first introduced in unbranded white papers, circulated internally among IXPs 2 decades earlier. None of this was directed. There was no grand strategy, just adaptation to pressure. And when systems are under stress, they fall back to what already works. That year, several national regulators introduced incentives for cross-jurisdictional failover compliance. But they didn't define what compliance meant. Instead, industry groups filled the void, issuing documentation based on previously accepted practice. The wording, almost verbatim, matched templates drawn from Remy-linked protocol families. The Remys did not return to the spotlight. Their structures did not expand. What changed was ambient authority. In a world suddenly reaware of digital fragility, the invisible logic that had always shaped interconnection was treated not as background, but as baseline. They didn't seize the moment. The moment curved toward them. Power didn't resurface. It settled deeper. By the early 2020s, the last remaining human fingerprints had faded from the structure. The Remy name no longer appeared in any official record, nor was it needed to. Their influence had moved fully into what engineers sometimes call non-optional architecture, a category of logic so deeply embedded in systems that removing it would mean disabling the systems themselves. The transformation had taken decades. It began with documentation, procedures, clauses, formatting. It continued through adoption, quiet, accumulative, rarely acknowledged. But by now, the system had entered its final phase. Self-perpetuation. Not through control, but through dependence. No single company, government, or agency used the Remy system. They required it, often without knowing. The shift was not symbolic. It was mechanical. In Brussels, a trust that once held ownership of legacy routing templates dissolved quietly. Its intellectual property transferred not to a successor company, but to a data commons maintained by an academic coalition. The coalition's steering committee rotated annually. It had no chairman. It followed inherited rules that hadn't been edited since 2012. Rules designed by a task force whose founding grant came from a Luxembourg entity, whose archives are now digital only, maintained by a foundation that no longer lists a website. In Singapore, an automated verification protocol used by Tier 2 providers to validate root resilience before approving new peering agreements was updated via blockchain timestamping, a method introduced to ensure auditability. The update referenced a stability matrix created in 2009 by a joint working group. That matrix matched, line for line, a Remy origin document originally drafted for cross-border telecommunication stability in the pre-IPv6 era. The engineers maintaining the protocol had never seen the original. They simply kept using what worked. This pattern repeated across jurisdictions. In São Paulo, a network compliance platform maintained by a private sector alliance of IXPs integrated routing fallback scenarios directly into its UI. The interface logic, drop-down escalation paths, procedural timeouts, default capacity prioritization, all mirrored clause structures buried in mid-2000s carrier arbitration archives. The platform team didn't attribute those clauses. They assumed them as inherited best practices. In Stockholm, a data modeling firm licensed a packet analysis engine used for predictive traffic modeling. The engine's behavioral assumptions, packet loss thresholds, recovery intervals, loopback tolerances, were based on test suites calibrated to reflect industry-standard BGP drift tolerances. The tolerances were never defined, but the values matched the thresholds set by a now-defunct Remy-affiliated calibration library from 2002. Nothing was hidden, nothing was encrypted, but very little remained human. At some point, the system had stopped requiring oversight. Ownership fragmented into regulatory shadows, foundations, advisory panels, academic custodians, public-private research ventures. Each controlled one node, one template, one table of values. No single entity could claim visibility over the whole. And even if it could, it wouldn't matter. The system no longer responded to direction. It responded to compliance. What mattered now were interfaces. A multinational cloud provider deploying new inter-region routing capacity didn't ask who set the interoperability requirement. They asked whether the deployment matched the pre-certified procedural definitions held by a consortium of neutral validators in Dublin. Validators operating under a rotating grant model inherited from a Remy trust dissolved in 2011. The people who made the decision no longer existed. But the decision did. And this was the point. The Ramirs had never aimed to last as a name. They aimed to last as a logic. They didn't want influence. They wanted inertia, not visibility, structure. There were no heirs, no public figures, no legacy to preserve. Just a procedural rhythm, self-correcting, self-replicating, impossible to unwind without disabling the very systems it supported. In the rare case someone tried, say, a government attempting to impose new conditions on national routing, they would soon discover that doing so would require renegotiating compliance across 30 or 40 networks, each governed by its own agreements, each dependent on slightly different versions of the same compatibility baseline. Change was possible, but the effort required coordination at a scale no one was prepared to attempt. So the old rules remained. Because they were there. Because they worked. Because no one could afford to replace them. And the Ramirs? They had become precisely what they set out to be. Absent. Their system lived on, not in memory, but in motion. Today, when a phone connects to Wi-Fi in a hotel lobby in Jakarta, or when a smart fridge updates its firmware in suburban Lyon, or when a shipping terminal in Rotterdam pings an availability API in Seoul, no one pauses to ask how the data knows where to go. The handshake happens. The packet routes. The result arrives. Seamless, immediate, assumed. But behind that immediacy is a choreography, one that no single company, agency, or engineer fully understands. The routing paths are shaped not just by algorithms, but by agreements. Agreements shaped by formats. Formats shaped by clauses. Clauses shaped by documents. And those documents, many of them decades old, still carry within them the residue of logic laid down by a family that no longer exists in any visible form. The Ramir structure no longer governs. It guides, passively, indirectly, yet unmistakably, through peering policy defaults, through compatibility thresholds, through fallback language inserted into new contracts, because that's just how it's done. Even in emerging networks, in countries building infrastructure from scratch, the templates are often imported whole, pre-labeled as neutral best practice. But neutrality, in this case, is historical. It is the result of choices made long before the current generation began connecting. Power, here, is not felt as force. It is felt as the absence of friction. Every time a platform expands into a new market and connects instantly, it does so along paths designed to conform. Not because of legal obligation, but because deviation is incompatible with speed. Every time a new interconnection hub negotiates routing terms with upstream providers, the documents used already presume a logic of escalation and capacity prioritization that was never voted on, but universally accepted. This is how influence survives when it no longer needs acknowledgement. And so the system continues, borderless, authorless, quiet. When a network outage occurs, teams investigate traffic, not treaties. When a packet drops, they check for latency, not licensing. The deeper conditions are rarely questioned, because they seem to have always been there. But those conditions shape what is possible. Who connects to whom? Whose traffic gets through first? Who disappears when the load is too high? There is no conspiracy, no mastermind, no operator behind the curtain. Only a long series of formatting choices, now indistinguishable from the infrastructure itself. We say the internet is open, and in many ways, it is. But the routes it takes, the permissions it requires, the languages it speaks, all flow through assumptions inherited, not chosen. And some of those assumptions trace back to a family no one remembers. Their legacy is not a product, not a building, not even a name. It is a system that simply never stopped being used. And true infrastructure doesn't win. It waits. Because in the end, the most enduring power is the kind that no longer needs to be enforced, only followed.